It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Princess Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong, and it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumour soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded behind those closed doors was not routine, not ceremonial, and certainly not something the palace was prepared to explain. Catherine had entered that room composed, steady, fully aware of the weight she carried, but she left shaken in a way that insiders would later describe as deeply unsettling. The presence of medical advisors alone raised quiet alarms, but it was the urgency, the secrecy, and the sudden tightening of communication that transformed concern into something far more serious. Aides were instructed to remain silent, conversations were abruptly cut short, and even long-trusted staff found themselves excluded from information they would normally be privy to. It was as if a protective wall had been thrown up overnight, shielding something fragile and deeply personal from the outside world. Reports began to circulate in careful whispers, something about a sudden health development concerning Princess Charlotte, something unexpected, something that had not been anticipated even within the inner circle. Catherine's pale expression as she stepped away from the meeting became the focal point of speculation, her usual composure replaced by a tension that could not be disguised. And then there was William, whose quiet but unmistakable shift in demeanour did not go unnoticed. Later that evening, he was seen comforting Charlotte, his presence protective, almost shielding, as if the moment carried a gravity far beyond what anyone was being told. For weeks, media insiders had sensed that something was off. Subtle schedule changes, brief appearances, carefully worded statements that revealed nothing while hinting at everything. But now, those fragments were beginning to align, forming a picture that suggested this was not an isolated concern, but part of something deeper, something the palace had been struggling to contain. The silence was no longer just precautionary, it was strategic. And the more they tried to control the narrative, the more intense the speculation became. Because within royal walls, silence is never empty, it is filled with meaning, with fear, with decisions that ripple far beyond the moment they are made. And as the truth edged closer to the surface, one thing became painfully clear. This was not just about a sudden development, not just about a private family concern, it was the beginning of something that would challenge not only Catherine and William, but the very structure of how the royal family protects its own. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's health, it was tied to a royal legacy that had long been buried. Until now. Long before the public even sensed a shift, subtle movements were already reshaping the structure of royal succession discussions behind closed doors, movements so calculated, so discreet that even senior aides struggled to understand their full implications until it was already too late. What began as quiet, almost routine conversations carried an undercurrent that felt different, heavier, as though each word spoken behind those guarded doors was carefully chosen to conceal as much as it revealed. There was no official declaration, no sudden announcement, just a gradual tightening of language, a shift in tone that only those closest to the process could detect. Legal advisors, once brought in for periodic consultation, were now being called upon with increasing urgency, revisiting protocols that had long been considered settled. Their involvement signaled something deeper than routine review. It hinted at a reassessment of the very foundation upon which royal continuity stood. And yet, even within those discussions, clarity remained elusive, replaced by a cautious precision that suggested decisions were being shaped long before they would ever be acknowledged. As these conversations evolved, one name began to surface in ways that caught even seasoned insiders off guard: Princess Beatrice. Her presence within high-level discussions was not announced, not explained, but quietly accepted as if it had always been intended. Those who noticed did so with unease, questioning how and why her role had expanded so suddenly into territory traditionally reserved for a far narrower circle. It was not merely her inclusion that raised questions, but the timing of it, arriving at a moment when the tone of internal briefings had already begun to shift. References to lineage, once delivered with certainty and confidence, were now framed with careful ambiguity, as though the established narrative was being reconsidered piece by piece. The language changed first, subtle, almost imperceptible adjustments that signaled a broader transformation taking place beneath the surface. With each passing week, the sense of stability that had long defined the royal line began to feel less certain, replaced by a quiet but growing concern about what lay ahead. Conversations that once centered on continuity now carried an edge of urgency, as if those involved were racing against time to address something they could no longer ignore. The unspoken question lingered in every exchange: was the structure they had relied upon truly as secure as it appeared? And if not, what would it take to preserve it? The answers were never given directly, but the actions spoke loudly enough. Long-standing assumptions were no longer treated as immovable truths, and the careful distancing from previously accepted succession narratives suggested that a recalibration was already underway. What made these developments all the more unsettling was not their visibility, but their invisibility. Nothing outwardly confirmed the shift, yet everything within the inner circle pointed to it. It was a transformation happening in fragments, in quiet approvals and unspoken agreements, each one building upon the last until the cumulative effect could no longer be ignored. Those who tried to piece it together found themselves confronting a reality that felt both deliberate and inevitable, as though the course had been set long before anyone realized they were already moving along it. And as the implications of those early adjustments began to take shape, one truth became impossible to dismiss. This was not a temporary reconsideration, not a moment of caution. It was the beginning of a fundamental change in how the future of the royal line would be defined. But as these quiet adjustments gained momentum, it became clear they were leading towards something far more decisive than anyone had anticipated. It was the alliance no one saw coming: Princess Beatrice stepping into a role that placed her alongside Catherine in discussions that carried consequences far beyond ceremonial duty, signaling a shift that would ripple through every layer of royal expectation. At first, it seemed almost incidental, a quiet inclusion that could easily be overlooked, but within the inner workings of the monarchy, nothing is ever accidental. Beatrice's presence began to carry weight, not through grand gestures or public acknowledgement, but through the growing trust placed in her by those who shaped the institutions. Most guarded decisions. Senior figures who once viewed her position as peripheral now found themselves listening more closely, drawing her into conversations that demanded not only discretion, but resolve. And at the center of it all stood Catherine, measured, composed, yet undeniably aware that the ground beneath them was shifting in ways that could not be undone. Their alignment did not announce itself with declarations or formal recognition. It unfolded gradually, through shared understanding and an unspoken agreement that the stakes had changed. Conversations between them, once occasional and contained, became more frequent, more deliberate, touching on matters that extended far beyond immediate concerns. These were not discussions shaped by tradition alone, but by a growing urgency to protect something far more fragile than outward appearances suggested. Legal and constitutional advisors were brought into these private consultations, their involvement underscoring the seriousness of what was being considered. Protocols were examined, reinterpreted, and quietly questioned, as though the very framework of royal continuity was being tested against a future that no longer felt predictable. What made this alliance so significant was not just the roles they were stepping into, but the recognition spoken only in the most guarded circles that those roles were evolving. In real time, Beatrice was no longer simply participating. She was contributing, influencing, and, in subtle but unmistakable ways, helping to shape the direction of decisions that would define the monarchy's path forward. Within internal briefings, her name began to carry a different tone, one that acknowledged her growing importance without ever stating it outright. It was a transformation that unfolded quietly, but its impact was impossible to ignore. And as her connection with Catherine deepened, it became clear that this was not a temporary alignment, not a response to a passing concern, but part of a broader, more deliberate approach taking shape behind closed doors. Whispers of coordination began to circulate among those closest to the process, not as rumors, but as cautious observations. There was a sense that something was being built carefully, strategically, an approach that relied on unity, on shared purpose, and on the willingness to confront realities that had long been set aside. The focus was no longer limited to immediate challenges. It extended to the long-term stability of the monarchy itself, to the preservation of a structure that now seemed more vulnerable than it had in generations. And within that focus, the partnership between Beatrice and Catherine stood as both a response and a signal, a sign that the monarchy was preparing to adapt in ways it had resisted before. But beneath the surface of cooperation lay a deeper tension, an unspoken understanding that what they were confronting could not be resolved through alignment alone, because the questions driving these changes were not simple, and the answers they demanded would not come without consequence. Yet this emerging partnership wasn't just about cooperation, it was about confronting a question the monarchy had long avoided. At the heart of the unfolding tension was a question so sensitive, so unprecedented, that even within the palace it was spoken only in fragments, never fully, never openly, but always with an understanding of its explosive implications. It lingered in half-finished sentences and carefully measured pauses, a presence that could not be ignored yet, could not be acknowledged without consequence. Those closest to the matter understood that this was not simply a theoretical debate, not a distant possibility to be quietly filed away, but a reality pressing against the very boundaries of what the monarchy had always defined as untouchable. And as that pressure intensified, the long-standing rules governing succession, once treated as fixed, almost sacred, were drawn back into scrutiny, examined not for what they had always been, but for what they might now mean in a world that had shifted beneath them. Legal advisors found themselves navigating a maze of interpretation, where every clause carried weight and every precedent raised more questions than it answered. The position of the Sussex children, once assumed to be clearly defined within the established order, became a focal point of this renewed examination. Yet nothing about it was straightforward. Each interpretation seemed to open another layer of complexity, forcing those involved to confront the uncomfortable reality that tradition alone could no longer provide certainty. It was not simply a matter of law, but of perception, of how the monarchy balanced its historic foundations with the expectations of a modern audience that no longer accepted silence as an answer. Within internal discussions, the divide became increasingly apparent. Some argued for caution, insisting that revisiting established norms risked unraveling a system that depended on continuity and public confidence. Others pushed for clarity, warning that avoiding the issue would only deepen the uncertainty already taking hold. The tension between those positions created a fragile equilibrium, one that could not hold indefinitely, because beneath every argument, beneath every carefully worded statement, lay a deeper fear, the fear of how such a decision would be received beyond palace walls. Public backlash was no longer a distant concern, it was an immediate reality, shaped by a world that watched more closely and judged more quickly than ever before. And yet, the greater risk was not in action, but in inaction. The longer the question remained unaddressed, the more it eroded the sense of stability that the monarchy relied upon. Silence, once a powerful tool of control, began to feel like a vulnerability, a gap through which speculation and doubt could grow unchecked. Those tasked with safeguarding the institution understood this all too well. They could feel the shift, the moment when discretion no longer protected, but instead threatened to expose. The weight of that realization changed the tone of every conversation, adding urgency to decisions that had once been approached with measured patience. As the debate deepened, it became clear that this was not a question that could be deferred or diluted. It demanded resolution, not because it was convenient, but because it was inevitable. The monarchy stood at a crossroads where tradition and transformation collided, where every possible path carried both risk and consequence. And in that moment of reckoning, one truth emerged with undeniable force. The cost of choosing would be significant, but the cost of avoiding the choice could be far greater. And once the question was finally faced, the path forward demanded a decision that would change everything. When the decision was finally set into motion, it did not arrive with a formal declaration or public acknowledgement, but its impact was immediate, sending shockwaves through the delicate balance that had held the monarchy together for years. There was no single moment that marked its beginning, no clear line where one reality ended and another took its place. Yet those within the inner circle felt it unmistakably. Conversations changed overnight, the tone sharpened, the margins for uncertainty narrowed, and what had once been discussed as possibility was now treated as direction. Strategic steps were taken with precision, each one measured not only for its immediate effect, but for the ripple it would create in the days and weeks ahead. Nothing was left to chance, yet everything carried risk. Because redefining succession was never just about structure, it was about perception, about trust, about the fragile belief that the monarchy remained steady even when it was, quietly reshaping itself from within. Consensus, once difficult to secure, began to form under the weight of necessity. It was not unanimous, not without resistance, but it was enough. Enough to move forward, enough to act, enough to justify decisions that only weeks earlier would have seemed unthinkable. Those who had hesitated found themselves confronted by a reality that no longer allowed delay. The question had been asked, the debate had unfolded, and now the answer, however complex, however uncomfortable, had to be carried through. Yet even as agreement took shape, the approach remained cautious, almost restrained. There would be no immediate exposure, no sudden shift that could trigger scrutiny before the foundation was fully secured. Instead, the changes were woven into the fabric of internal discussions, altering the way lineage was framed, the way roles were described, the way the future was spoken about in rooms where every word mattered. Senior royals, fully aware of the gravity of what was unfolding, began to prepare in their own ways. Some leaned into the process, aligning themselves with the emerging direction, while others watched carefully, measuring the cost of what was being set in motion. Because beneath the controlled language and calculated steps, there was an undeniable tension and understanding that this decision, once fully realized, would not remain contained. The potential for fallout was not a distant concern, it was an inevitability waiting for its moment. And so, alongside the structural adjustments, a narrative began to take shape, carefully constructed to guide how the changes would eventually be understood. It was not about revealing everything, but about revealing enough to maintain confidence, enough to preserve continuity, enough to ensure that the monarchy's image remained intact even as its internal dynamics shifted. What made this moment so pivotal was not just the decision itself, but the way it was being carried forward quietly, deliberately, with an awareness that every move would be scrutinized once it came to light. The balance between transparency and protection became increasingly difficult to maintain, yet it was essential. Because if handled too openly, the consequences could spiral beyond control. If kept too hidden, the eventual revelation could be even more damaging. And within that tension, the monarchy found itself navigating a path that demanded both strength and subtlety, certainty and restraint. From the outside, nothing appeared to have changed. The structure remained intact, the roles unchanged, the image carefully preserved. But beneath that surface, the foundations were shifting. reshaped by decisions that carried both immediate impact and long-term consequence. And as those consequences began to take form, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a far more complex unraveling one that would test not just the institutions' resilience, but the people at its very core. But while the structure appeared intact from the outside, the emotional and political consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Not all consequences are visible, and within the palace, the aftermath of this decision unfolded in ways that could not be acknowledged publicly, creating a tension that lingered beneath every carefully managed appearance. What had been set into motion could not be undone, and yet its full impact was not something that could be openly addressed. Instead, it revealed itself in quieter ways through measured words, through pauses that carried more meaning than statements ever could, through the subtle shift in how those at the center of power related to one another. Senior royals, bound by duty and expectation, kept their reactions tightly controlled, aware that even the smallest fracture could invite scrutiny they were not prepared to face. But restraint does not erase emotion, and beneath that composed surface, there was an unmistakable strain, one that grew more difficult to ignore with each passing day. Efforts to maintain unity became not just a priority, but a necessity. Every interaction was weighed, every response considered, as though the stability of the institution depended on an unspoken agreement to hold the line. And yet, unity in such circumstances is rarely effortless. It demands compromise, silence, and at times, the quiet suppression of personal conviction. Those within the inner circle understood this, even if they never voiced it. The decision had drawn lines that could not easily be blurred, creating a delicate balance between acceptance and unease. Conversations that once flowed with ease now carried an undercurrent of caution, as if each word had to be carefully chosen to avoid exposing what lay beneath. The dynamics had changed not dramatically, not in ways that could be pointed to directly, but in subtle shifts that altered the tone of every exchange. Advisors worked tirelessly behind the scenes, their role no longer limited to guidance, but extending into stabilization. They monitored reactions, anticipated risks, and sought ways to reinforce the sense of continuity that the monarchy depended upon. Their task was as much about perception as it was about reality, ensuring that the outward image remained intact even as the internal landscape continued to shift. But even with their efforts, there was a growing awareness that what had been set in motion carried implications far beyond the immediate moment. This was not a temporary disruption. It was a change that would shape the monarchy's future in ways that could not yet be fully understood. That awareness settled heavily within the palace, influencing decisions in ways both subtle and profound. The long-term implications began to take on a weight of their own, raising questions that extended beyond the present and into the uncertain years ahead. How would this decision be remembered? How would it redefine expectations, not just within the institution, but in the eyes of those who observed it from afar? These questions lingered, unanswered but impossible to dismiss, adding another layer of complexity to an already fragile situation. And so, a balance began to form, fragile, carefully maintained, but inherently unstable. It was a balance built not on resolution but on adaptation, on the ability to move forward despite the tension that remained unresolved. Within that balance lay both strength and vulnerability, a reflection of a monarchy striving to preserve its identity, while navigating a reality that demanded change. And as those within its walls adjusted to this new equilibrium, it became clear that the aftermath was not something that could simply be contained or managed. It was evolving, expanding, shaping the institution in ways that would only become visible over time. And as the palace worked to contain the fallout, a larger transformation was already taking shape. What emerged from the silence was not just the aftermath of a single decision, but the outline of a monarchy, quietly redefining itself, adapting to pressures that could no longer be ignored, and doing so with a precision that revealed both urgency and intent. Beneath the calm exterior, Priorities were shifting in ways that could not be reversed, placing stability and control above all else, even when that meant stepping away from traditions that had once seemed unbreakable. The familiar structure was no longer enough on its own. It had to be reinforced, reshaped, and in some cases reimagined entirely. Trusted figures were no longer simply fulfilling roles, they were being strategically positioned, drawn closer to the center of influence, not by chance, but by design. And in that careful positioning, a pattern began to emerge, one that suggested the monarchy was no longer reacting to events as they unfolded, but actively shaping the path ahead, with a level of foresight that spoke to just how serious the situation had become. At the heart of this transformation was a deeper understanding that the future could no longer be left to assumption. Long-term planning was no longer a distant exercise. It was driving immediate action, influencing decisions that would ripple far beyond the present moment. Catherine and Beatrice, once navigating their roles within established expectations, now found themselves part of something far more significant, a recalibration of purpose that placed them at the intersection of tradition and change. Their influence, subtle yet undeniable, reflected a monarchy learning to adapt not through grand declarations, but through quiet, deliberate steps that carried lasting impact. Because in this world, it is often the decisions made without announcement that leave the deepest mark, shaping outcomes long before they are ever understood. And yet, for all the strategy and control, there remained an undeniable tension, a recognition that adaptation comes with cost. The balance between preserving heritage and embracing evolution is never simple, never without consequence. Each step forward carried the weight of what might be lost, even as it secured what might be saved. The monarchy, long defined by its ability to endure, now faced a different challenge: the need to transform without losing the very identity that had sustained it for generations. It was a delicate, almost impossible balance, one that demanded resilience not just from the institution, but from the individuals within it. In the end, this was never just about a single moment or a single decision. It was about the legacy being shaped in real time, one that would define the monarchy long after the current storm had passed. The implications stretched far beyond immediate concerns, touching the very foundation of royal succession and the expectations that came with it. What Catherine and Beatrice had stepped into was not merely responsibility, but influence and opportunity to guide the monarchy through uncertainty while ensuring its continuity. In a world that no longer stood still, and as these quiet decisions continued to unfold, their impact would not be measured in days or weeks, but in years, even generations, leaving a legacy defined not by what was seen, but by what was chosen in moments of greatest uncertainty. Because within the royal family, even the quietest decisions can echo the loudest, and this one may only just be beginning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.